Welcome to another episode of Witty CFB. Your host Rob Sheply here, and on today's episode, we are going to be discussing matchup between UCF versus Florida, Week 6 matchup, 7:30 on the SEC Network. It's definitely a game that I'm excited about as someone who I'm sure, as you guys know, who's been following this program. I've been covering Florida for a number of years now. I went to college down, not at Florida University, but a school very, very close to there, and it's a team that's near and dear to my heart. And I'm excited. I'm excited for this matchup. To me, as someone who's looking at this primarily from a Florida perspective, this is pretty much going to be the catalyst for how the season goes. Because right now, after watching UCF last week lose to Colorado, which I was completely inaccurate about, and I'll be the first one to admit that on this program that I definitely underestimated Colorado in a number of different ways. But in terms of Florida going into this matchup versus UCF, I mean, you think you got to be excited for a number of reasons. I think first and foremost, a lot of this matchup can be a way for Billy Napier to buy himself some more time, especially if he can pull off a win versus UCF, and let's say he does end up losing a bunch of these marquee matchups. There will be some more justification in terms of keeping it either keeping him or as justification to say, hey, at least let him finish out the season, and then you can figure it out from there in terms of what to do with the staff. Or is there any, because in my opinion, any way that you can find a way to keep the coach there, you should, because a lot of times we're in a society now where where the message always just to fire the coach instead of trying to be creative and work through the mishaps that you have at the moment. But going to this matchup, I mean, right now Billy Napier is 5-6 against power conference schools, which is a startling contrast compared to the 68-5 record that Steve Spurrier had in his 12 seasons as head coach of the Florida Gators. And even when you look at the past like 2 decades, it I don't think it definitely is articulated enough, talked about enough to the point where how much of an advantage it truly is to be at the Swamp. Even when in the days of Urban Meyer and Steve Spurrier and Ron Zook, it was one of the hardest places, if not the hardest place in the country to play. And I think based on the momentum that Florida did have the other week versus Mississippi State, and now you're coming into this matchup having a legitimate shot at really, swinging the pendulum and really having a good chance at putting this all together. There's going to be a lot of excitement, a lot of enthusiasm. I definitely expect a sold out crowd to be there too, especially too. There's as much pressure as there is going to be on Florida, and that's primarily what the storyline is going to be. There's just as much as UCF too. I mean, if you're UCF, you're constantly being overlooked by Florida State and Miami and Florida University. You have a coach in Gus Malzahn who's, like I said, I've always said he's a really good coach. He's turned around that program. He's done a lot of good there, and he's kept a winning culture there, and he has brought in a lot of good players too. I mean, I think KJ Jefferson is a pretty quality passer. I talked about him last week a little bit, and even too, he has experience against this Florida team. When he started at Arkansas, he does have a victory versus them, so he's going to know what works and what doesn't, and he's experienced in these sort of games too. And we even saw it last week. As much as you know UCF struggled, you do see throughout the season how much he's progressed, and I only anticipate it being a really tough matchup for a number of reasons. Yeah, even when you look at this too, I mean, what's what worries me the most coming from a Florida perspective is you got to think about how awful this rushing defense has been in general. But the Texas A&M game to me was the most startling when they had that 99-yard drive, and they ran 13 run plays in a row with Marcel Reed and all those boys there, again 300 rushing yards. And it was, I think that definitely started the point of you know, rumblings of Billy Napier ultimately, getting fired, or rumors of getting fired, or discussions about having the buyout ready. I think just that performance in general served as the catalyst of it, which is well warranted too, because watching that game, I was quite frankly just disgusted the way that the defense played. I mean, even looking at it full circle, not just in the rushing attack too, even in the secondary, there was a lot of blown coverages, giving up a lot of explosive plays that quite frankly you just can't give up when you're playing teams of the caliber like a Texas A&M. And especially you're home too. That's the biggest thing, is you have one of the best advantages in all of college football, and then you turn out a dud like that. So I think in many ways there's a lot of pressure on both teams, but it's in a slightly different way. And for this Florida team too, I mean, you got to. I don't know if Billy Napier is playing for his job. I'm not going to sit there and say that, and I still don't believe that. But you have to imagine, at the very least, Florida has to be competitive in this game. I mean, there's no way around that. But to me, when I look at this team from a Florida perspective, there's three things that have to happen in order for them to win this game. I think first and foremost, it's we need to see a game where Graham Mertz just goes off. When I mean go off, I mean 300 plus passing yards, no interceptions, at least three touchdowns. To me, this is the game where everything really has to come legitimately together. And I understand, they won by over three possessions versus Mississippi State, and yes, that's a solid win, but it's not. Mississippi State is nowhere near where UCF is right now, and in order for Florida to be really taken seriously again anytime soon, it's an absolute must in order for you know the administration to at least be not as worried, be able to have the fan base back in it. And I think most importantly, just instilling some confidence in this team. And, two, we've talked about this on the show too, having this back and forth between Graham Mertz, DJ Lagway, who do you start? But another thing is too, you have to think about it from this perspective. If I'm DJ Lagway, you know, do I really want to go through this shitstorm that you're in right now? Because DJ Lagway could just as much say, hey Florida, this was great, this was fun, but I'm out of here, and I'm going to take another starting job somewhere, and can probably start right away, especially if it's for a program similar to Florida too, because we've seen enough out of him, whether it's through his high school film, or even through the little tidbits that we've seen throughout the season this year, is that there are some incredible throws that he's made that only someone of his skill level can do. He has that mobility aspect too that adds another dynamic element to a Florida offense that desperately needs it. And I think too, he's definitely maximized the talent that he's had around him. I mean, we talked about this before. Eugene Wilson had that knee surgery, and he's been out for a while. A lot of the other Florida playmakers, for the most part, are younger kids. And then you have a guy like Montrell Johnson, who's a senior this year, who came in from Louisiana with Billy Napier, who I think is also due for another really strong game too. So I think number one, most importantly, is you got to find a way for Graham Mertz to really get comfortable and be able to make some big plays. If I were Billy Napier and I'm drawing up this offense, I'm saying to myself, let's get the short pass game going for be able to make those third downs as manageable as possible. Those third and threes, third and fours that they're gonna have to win in order to get this game close. I think number two, you have to add on to that. Montrell Johnson, yes, you need to get him going and get him a good amount of quality carries, but I think having Johnson in there and trying to get UCF to stack the box, I think is going to also bring an element of some play action. I think the bread and butter of Graham Mertz is that intermediate passing, where it's that 8 to 15 yard range where he can get his guys in stride and let his receivers get yards after a catch too. Because as I've been watching film on him for the past couple seasons now, to me that really is his bread and butter. That's one of his biggest strengths in terms of his mechanics, his overall arm accuracy, all of that too, is that intermediate range. Because I think it's been criticized before, and rightfully so, that Graham Mertz doesn't necessarily have the arm strength and the feel that he does have on the intermediate passes, not as much on the long passes. So for me, I definitely think it's smart to really focus on that short to intermediate range, and then you can possibly dial it up a little bit when you get into those second down situations. I don't mind seeing a little bit more aggressiveness coming out from Napier's playbook, because the one criticism I think is completely valid about Florida's offense is sometimes the play calling is way too conservative, a lot of BS screen calls that don't need to happen, and quite frankly, not getting Montrell Johnson involved enough in the passing game as well. I've slammed my fist saying that over and over again, and to me, this is the game that I think you really have to see that. And outside of that, I think number two, what has to happen is Florida has to play more disciplined in order for them to win this game. I'm so sick of seeing missed tackles, personal fouls, pass interference calls, just multiple penalty after penalty after penalty that's ultimately causing them to lose games, not be able to get off the field. And you can see the frustration on the players' faces week after week after week. And at the end of the day, I think Ron Roberts, he's a solid coach. He has a has a good pedigree. He was a D1 football head coach at Southeastern Louisiana. He was defense coordinator last year at Auburn. So yes, he's earned all of his stripes doing all of that. But at the same time, playing undisciplined more or less comes down to coaching. And when you have a team like Florida who spent so much money on upgrading their facilities, increasing increasing the amount of money that they put towards their assistant pool, to me it's just inexcusable and unacceptable in terms of how lackluster this defense has been. I mean, they they're consistently in the top 20 recruiting class every year. They don't do bad in the transfer portal, and they have enough resources to the point where they can fill in a lot of those guys via the transfer portal if there is a time where a need is necessary. And we haven't really seen a legitimate game where Florida's really able to put that all together, because I think right now the defensive line has been laughable. The quarterbacks that they've played have pretty much had all day to throw, outside of the Mississippi State game, who I think it was Blake Shapen who tore his shoulder against us. But outside of that, when you look at all the other games when they played Miami, I mean, Cam Ward was able to do whatever he wanted. He sat in the pocket all day. He found all his weapons, and he really had nothing to worry about. I mean, he probably came out of that game and didn't even have any dirt on his shirt. So it's one of those things where you know you have to you just have to play more disciplined, and you're really going to have to get those open field tackles in order for Florida to really have any shot at winning this game. And I think lastly, in terms of what really needs to happen in order to win this game, is I think you have to find a way to make KJ Jefferson throw the ball. Now I just talked about KJ Jefferson a little bit earlier, and I'm not saying he's a bad passer, because he's not a bad passer at all. When he was with Arkansas last year, he showed that he has a hell of an arm. He's a quality passer, and he is experienced enough to understand where to be able to know how to read a defense, know where the open guys are, and understand the different concepts and playbooks that he's seeing. He's played in enough SEC situations where he's comfortable out there. And if I'm UCF and I'm asking myself, how am I going to exploit this Florida defense that has historically this season played pretty awful? I think there's a couple of things that you're going to anticipate. I think number one, if you're, you know, if yeah, I'd say number one, if you're UCF, I'm definitely going to spread out the field as much as I can. I anticipate seeing some maybe some quarterback draws, quarterback blasts, where KJ Jefferson is a quality enough runner where you're in those those really critical third down situations where he is big enough and strong enough to be able to fight for those quality yards, especially if you don't want to use that three-man rotation in Montgomery and RJ Harvey and all of those guys too. So I think you have four really quality runners that you can use right there. I imagine, much like they did against Colorado and TCU. I imagine some RPOs. I think a lot of counters, some mixed direction plays where UCF's going to be able to spread them across the field, give them different looks, and be able to maximize, be able to get this rushing attack going. I mean, I think if you're UCF, you got to stick with your bread and butter, which has been running the football, averaging at least 200 plus yards a game, and doing more or less what you did the first 4 games against some of the tune-up games that you had earlier this season. And so if you're Florida, I I think you have to bring in some safeties, particularly up top, be able to pressure them a little bit more, because you already know if they're stacking the box, you should expect some more stuff outside. Because at the moment, I don't think their linebacking core right now is strong enough to be able to really put KJ Jefferson under enough distress. So if I'm Ron Roberts, I think you have to be creative in terms of this defensive scheme that you put out. You can't let KJ Jefferson feel uncomfortable. You have to pressure him and use that home field advantage as much as you can, because if this gets out of hand where UCF can get enough explosive plays to the point where you know you're taking Florida's defense out of it, and Graham Mertz is just out in the football field all day having to try to throw it in the air, then it could be rough for Florida. But I do think for both these teams, this is such a pinnacle game for them in terms of, because UCF is still fighting for a spot in that Big 12 championship and possibly a playoff spot. And meanwhile, Florida is at the moment really trying to determine what their future is going to be between Billy Napier, between the future of Scott Strickland. You have Jeremy Foley, who's in there temporarily, kind of trying to figure things out. And, even the president there is still undetermined too. But the good news for Florida is you have a really strong quarterback in Graham Mertz, who's efficient and has been a starter in FBS football for a number of years now, even with Wisconsin. You have Montrell Johnson, who is one of the most underappreciated running backs in all of football, who's athletic, he's elusive, and he is poised enough and confident enough to be able to attack those holes and be able to get those chunk yards in those situations. And most importantly, you got to take advantage of that home field, because if you can put that all together, this definitely is a realistic game for Florida to win. But in terms of both these programs, look for a very run heavy game where you're going to expect a lot of explosive plays with two defenses that are struggling. I'm anticipating at least 60 points plus between both of them, and possibly even being decided in the fourth quarter, or one of these teams running away with it if you get to a point where one team can just control the line of scrimmage and time of possession. But